a person who's going to share a little bit with us. His name is Luke O'Connell. He's the theology teacher at Georgetown Visitation. There you go. He's got a lot of credits on here. I'm not going to read any of them. My favorite thing is he's got 3 daughters, which means he's going to have to pay for a lot of weddings one day. And he said, I said, tell me one thing interesting about you. And he said, well, my brother is an ultimate fighter. And I'm like, that's really not about you. That's about your brother. But we'll take it, all right? Because, you know, he doesn't look like he could beat up his brother. I'll tell you that. But please welcome Luke O'Connell to share with us a little bit.
Thank you. Good morning, sisters and brothers. The story that I have to tell you today fittingly begins in this very building. It's a story about my best buddy, Dan Lyons. And when we were in college in 2001, the NBA hosted their All-Star game in this building. And they put out a call for volunteers to come practice on the floor so the cameramen could situate the cameras and they know where to train them on the players. And as most young men, my buddy Dan and I assumed, we immediately saw visions of great glory. We assumed that we would be playing on the court and the players would come out. They would invite us to hang out. We would spend a long time and eventually lead a long NBA career. And it didn't happen exactly like that. My buddy Dan and I were so excited for the day to come that when the day finally came, we coordinated together. We set our alarms. We went to sleep the night before, and it was a bitter cold winter day, much like today. And we killed our alarm and overslept, and when we finally woke up and realized what had happened, the day was long gone. And we went to the dining hall, sat there with our scrambled eggs and our regret, and eventually the guys that did come to this floor walked in and they started telling us about their day. And they told us, we were like, listen, was it fun? And they were like, yeah, we got to shoot around. And we were like, just tell us, did any of the players come out? And they were like, no, not really, just one. And we're like, which player? And they were like, Michael Jordan. We were devastated. And it strikes me that that's the telling lesson of today. Any great story is a love story, and this love story is a love story about presence and absence. And today is a very different day. Today is a different day for your presence. You made it here. You braved the cold and the brutal winter. You braved a society that doesn't always want to hear what you have to say. And in a particular way, your presence speaks to the great love and grace that's necessary for this movement to go on. And for your presence, I am grateful. There's a movement that calls itself Dying with Dignity. And it's a powerful movement. And in our country, 5 different states already have laws on the book that permit euthanasia and dying with dignity. And even that phrase, dying with dignity, has this kind of enormous rhetorical weight, like it's powerful. And there's really good people in this movement, hospice givers and terminally ill people and famous people like Brittany Maynard, who lost her life. And I mention them because in some way we stand for dignity ourselves, and it's necessary for us to reclaim dignity. There's 25 other states that are considering putting laws about euthanasia on the books, and they're doing so because of the words that the death with dignity laws say. And what they say is that what they do is allow terminally ill patients to hasten an inevitable and unavoidable death. So one person's not present here today, my buddy Dan Lyons. And I have to say his story is the one that has to be told in opposition to those that would say that suffering is a death without dignity. And I tell you this because there's lots of things I could say to you about Dan Lyons. He's the hero of this story. He's a great saint that certainly walked amongst you. He sat here at this Mass for Life, and he marched where we're going to march later today. He lived a life that was enormous in its breadth and in its love. At college, at high school, he was his valedictorian. At Catholic University across the way, he was the top of our class. And when he traveled with the Dear Missionaries of Charity and went to Kolkata and served with them. He hung out with our Franciscans and served in South Africa, and he served here in DC, helping people with mental and physical disabilities get jobs. And everywhere he went, people called him Danny Love, but just loved his presence. And so in a way, his absence strikes at the heart of who we are in this movement, because in June 8th of 2009, my buddy Dan was diagnosed with a rare form of adult leukemia called ALL. And over the next 5 years, that leukemia would ultimately take his life. But I think it's important to speak to what his life looked like before that, traveling the world as a pilgrim and serving all over the world. And if the dying with dignity people would have their way, they would hasten his inevitable and unavoidable death. But I ask you to consider for a moment what happened after his diagnosis. He met and fell in love with the love of his life. I shouldn't say met her. In fact, after all that traveling, he eventually found the girl that he would marry in his own backyard, in his hometown. And he proposed to her with the ridiculous amounts of hot air balloons and romance, and they got married and entered the sacrament of matrimony. He welcomed nephews and nieces. He became the godfather to my oldest daughter, who was born a year to the day after his diagnosis. And he endured all manner of terrible things during that time, a coma and a bone marrow transplant, and suffering that most of us will never have to endure. But he did so while giving us the grace of his presence. And even as he lost feeling in his hands and feet and lost his ability to see and hear, he never stopped speaking to the rest of us about the great grace and love. Like I said, we came to this place with dreams of glory when we came, with hopes that we would render this world a better and more beautiful place for the people that came after us. And we had dreams of NBA glory when the All-Star game came, and that's the thing that like young people do, we dream of glory. And during those last few days, there wasn't a lot of glory for Dan. But I will tell you the answer that he gave, and it's an answer I think all of you give. I look around you and I see a lot of extremists. Martin Luther King Jr. in his letter from a Birmingham jail said he was disappointed and upset at first when people called him an extremist. But eventually he was consoled because he started thinking of the other extremists like Jesus Christ, who was an extremist for love and truth and goodness. And so Dan, during those final days, face to face with his wife Hannah, taught me a little bit about the extremity of that love. Imagine, if you will, how you feel about that person that you're like really attracted to, and how you always want to look good for them and be there for them. And at the end of Dan's life, there wasn't a ton of glory. He was bedridden. And that girl that he wanted to impress and hold and be strong for was combing his hair and making sure he got to the bathroom and making sure that like he was comfortable and making sure that she was with him in the pain. And the only answer that the rest of us could see in the face of immeasurable suffering was the depth of her love for Dan and the depth of his love for her. This hero, the saint, was nearly blind, nearly deaf, and could not carry a tune, much less a cross. And Dan's was not the kind of peace that comes from the absence of suffering, but rather it revealed the depth of love. So, as Dan and Hannah were with one another towards the end of Dan's life, she gave that answer of love, a love that stands strong in the face of immeasurable suffering. And that's the kind of love I think that we are all called to today. And I want to leave you with some words from my buddy. He wrote this long ago, but I think it's fitting for us today, and I think perhaps Dan is present in all of you and finally made it to the floor of this Verizon Center as he'd so long hoped for. He said, "I believe in the heart. I believe in its healing power. I believe that the heart is where Christ dwells in us. It is our own private tabernacle that we carry everywhere. And I believe that the world would heal and unite if the heart guided everything that we do. We are disciples of the heart. I am talking about a crusade of love that we must wage." My brothers and sisters, give that answer of love. Welcome to the crusade of love. And let's go wage that love, that war, in that crusade against the suffering of this culture around us. Amen, and God bless.